My grandfather was always a strong presence in my life. He was the kind of man who commanded respect without ever raising his voice. When he passed away, I felt like a piece of my world crumbled. Visiting his grave became a ritual for me, a way to stay connected to the man who had taught me so much. The cemetery where he was buried wasn't far from my home. It was an old place with towering oak trees and weathered headstones that leaned slightly as if bowing to time. The paths were narrow, winding through the graves in a way that felt almost intentional, like they were guiding you through the memories of the people who rested there. I visited often, always bringing fresh flowers to place at his headstone. It was a peaceful place, or so I thought. One evening, just before sunset, I decided to visit my grandfather's grave. The sky was a dull orange, the sun hanging low, casting long shadows across the cemetery. The air was cool, with a slight breeze that rustled the leaves above. As I walked along the familiar path, I noticed how quiet it was. Even the birds seemed to have gone silent, leaving only the sound of my footsteps on the gravel. I reached my grandfather's grave and stood there for a while, lost in thought. The headstone was simple, just like the man it marked. I placed the flowers at its base and said a few words, my voice barely above a whisper. As the shadows grew longer, I felt a chill creep up my spine, but I brushed it off as the cooling evening air. With a final look at the headstone, I turned and made my way back to my car. Just as I reached the cemetery gates, my phone rang. The sound was startling in the silence, and I fumbled for a moment before pulling it out of my pocket. The screen showed an unknown number, but I answered it anyway. "Hello," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the stillness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence on the other end. Then a voice spoke, low and familiar. It was my grandfather's voice. "Why did you leave so soon?" he asked, the words slow and deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It couldn't be him. It wasn't possible. He was gone. I knew that, but the voice on the other end of the line was unmistakably his. So intense that I nearly dropped the phone. "Who is this?" I stammered, but there was no response. The line went dead, leaving only the faint sound of the wind through the trees. I stood there, phone still in hand, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My legs felt weak, and I leaned against the cemetery gate for support. Eventually, I convinced myself that it had to be a prank. Someone with a sick sense of humor. The voice had been too real, too familiar. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The memory of that voice haunted me, echoing in my mind every time I closed my eyes. Despite my fear, I knew I had to go back to the cemetery. I needed to see my grandfather's grave to reassure myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The sun was bright that day, casting sharp shadows across the ground as I walked the now familiar path. Everything looked the same as it always had, the trees, the headstones, the narrow paths winding through the graves. But something felt different, an unease that I couldn't quite place. As I approached my grandfather's grave, I stopped in my tracks. There, a few feet away from the headstone, stood a figure. It was my grandfather. He looked just as he had when he was alive, dressed in his usual clothes, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, as if he had been waiting for me. I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were rooted to the ground, and my breath caught in my throat. A chill ran down my spine, colder than anything I had ever felt before. My mind screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that place as possible. But my body refused to obey. Then slowly my grandfather's face began to change. His skin grew pale, his eyes hollow, his mouth twisted into a grimace that was nothing like the gentle smile I remembered. It was as if I was looking at a reflection of him, distorted and wrong. The figure took a step toward me, and that was when I finally found the strength to move. I turned and ran, not daring to look back. The path blurred beneath my feet as I sprinted toward the gate, my heart pounding in my ears. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers, trying to hold me back. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The fear that gripped me was stronger than anything I had ever felt. When I finally reached my car, I threw myself inside and locked the doors, my hands trembling. I sat there for a long time, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my eyes fixed on the cemetery gate. I half expected to see the figure standing there, watching me. But the gate remained empty. I never went back to that cemetery. I couldn't. Whatever I saw that day, whatever called me on that phone, it wasn't my grandfather. It was something else, something that should never have been disturbed. The memory of that day still haunts me. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I never thought working as a security guard at a cemetery would be this unsettling. It was supposed to be an easy job. Just watch over the place, make sure no one vandalizes the graves, and keep an eye out for any troublemakers. Most nights were uneventful, just me and the rows of tombstones under the moonlight. But then, things started to get strange. It all began about a month ago. I had just started my shift, walking my usual rounds with a flashlight in hand. The night was quiet, the kind of silence that felt too heavy, too thick. As I made my way through the cemetery, I noticed something out of place. There, standing by a grave, was a man. It was exactly 3 a.m., I remember, because I always checked my watch during my rounds. The man stood perfectly still, facing one of the older graves near the back of the cemetery. He was dressed in dark clothes, and from a distance, I couldn't make out much about him. Just that he was tall and had a kind of stillness about him that was unsettling. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He didn't even seem to hear me. He just stared at the grave, completely motionless. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was a mourner, visiting a loved one. It wasn't uncommon for people to visit graves at odd hours, especially if they were dealing with grief. Still, something about this man seemed off. The next night, at exactly 3 a.m., I saw him again. Same grave, same stillness. He didn't move, didn't react when I called out. It was like he was frozen in time. The third night, when I saw him again, I knew something was wrong. This wasn't normal. Nobody visits a grave at the same time every night, especially not in the dead of night without making a sound or showing any sign of life. Curiosity got the better of me. I began to keep an eye on him, watching from a distance as he stood there, always at 3 a.m., always by that same grave. The way he stared at the tombstone, it was as if he was waiting for something. But what, I couldn't tell. The more I watched, the more unsettled I became. It wasn't just that he was there every night, it was the way he seemed almost detached from everything. Like he wasn't there, like he was a part of the cemetery itself. After a week of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided I had to confront him, to find out who he was and what he was doing. That night, I waited until 2:45 a.m., hiding behind a large oak tree a short distance from the grave. At exactly 3 a.m. he appeared, just like before. My heart was pounding as I stepped out from behind the tree and walked toward him. As I got closer, I could make out more details. His clothes were old, tattered, even like they hadn't been washed in years. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, they were empty, void of any emotion or life. I called out to him again, my voice shaking. "Hey, what are you doing here?" He didn't respond. He didn't even blink. It was like he was in a trance, completely unaware of my presence. I took a deep breath and walked closer, reaching out to tap him on the shoulder. As soon as my hand touched him, he turned to face me. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. His face twisted into the most horrifying expression I've ever seen. His mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, showing teeth that were too long, too sharp. His eyes, once empty, were now filled with a kind of rage, a hatred that made my blood run cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare in terror as his face contorted further, the skin pulling back to reveal raw, decaying flesh underneath. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to get away from him, but he didn't move. He just stood there, grinning that terrible grin, his eyes locked onto mine. It felt like he was looking straight into my soul, and what he saw there filled him with that same rage. I knew I had to get out of there. I turned and ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I was back at the entrance of the cemetery, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold on to my flashlight. When I finally dared to look back, the man was gone. The grave he had been standing by was empty, just like all the others. I didn't sleep at all that night. The image of his twisted face, those lifeless eyes, burned into my mind. The next day, I tried to find out more about the grave he had been standing by, but there was nothing unusual about it. It belonged to a man who had died over 50 years ago, someone with no family left to visit him. There was no reason anyone should be there, especially not at 3 a.m. every night. I continued my job at the cemetery, but I never saw the man again. Every night at 3 a.m. I'd hold my breath, waiting to see if he would appear. But he never did. Still, the fear lingered, that sense that something wasn't right, that something was watching me. To this day I don't know what I saw, or what that man was, but I'll never forget the terror I felt when I looked into his eyes, and saw the darkness that lay behind them. Some things, I suppose, are better left alone, and some graves are best left undisturbed. My name is Hazel. I always loved my father deeply, and after he passed away, I made it a habit to visit his grave regularly. It was late afternoon, with the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the cemetery. The air was cool, and the silence around me felt heavy, almost like a blanket pressing everything down. As I walked through the rows of graves, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet was the only sound I could hear. The cemetery was old, with towering trees stretching endlessly upwards, their branches gnarled and twisted. The wind whispered through the leaves, creating a soft rustling sound that gave me a strange sense of unease. I reached my father's grave, a simple stone with his name etched into it. I knelt, placing fresh flowers beside the headstone, the bright colors a stark contrast against the cold gray of the stone. My heart ached as I thought of him, the memories of his laughter and his warmth flooding my mind. I closed my eyes, trying to hold on to those memories, to feel close to him even though he was gone. When I finally opened my eyes, something caught my attention out of the corner of my vision. A man stood a few rows away, lingering near a grave that I didn't recognize. He was dressed in dark, old-fashioned clothes that seemed out of place, almost like he had stepped out of a different time. His face was partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but what I could see of it seemed oddly blank, almost emotionless. Something was unsettling about him, something that didn't feel right. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just standing there. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I stayed at my father's grave a little longer, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every few minutes I glanced over at the man, but he didn't move. He just stood there, his gaze seemingly fixed on the grave in front of him. The longer I looked at him, the more uncomfortable I felt. Finally, I decided it was time to leave. I stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from my knees. The sun was dipping lower, casting the cemetery in an even gloomier light. I took one last look at my father's grave, whispered a quiet goodbye, and turned to leave. As I started walking back towards my car, I glanced over my shoulder. The man was still there, but now, his head was turned slightly, as if he was watching me. My heart began to race, a sense of dread creeping into my chest. I quickened my pace, the leaves crunching louder under my feet. As I hurried down the path, I looked back again, and my breath caught in my throat. The man was following me. He was walking slowly, almost leisurely, but there was no mistaking that he was coming after me. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands growing clammy with fear. I walked faster, trying to stay calm, but every time I glanced back, he was there, matching my pace, always just far enough away that I couldn't see his face. Panic started to set in. The cemetery was large, and my car felt like it was miles away. I forced myself to keep moving, not daring to look back anymore. The feeling of being followed, of those footsteps echoing mine, was overwhelming. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, and I could feel my pulse throbbing in my ears. Finally, I saw my car at the edge of the cemetery. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by terror as I heard the sound of footsteps growing closer behind me. I broke into a run, my feet pounding against the gravel path. I didn't dare look back, I just ran as fast as I could, the fear driving me forward. I reached my car, fumbling with the keys in my shaking hands. I could feel the man getting closer, the sense of his presence almost tangible. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and locking it. Just as I saw him reach the edge of the cemetery, he stood there just a few feet away, staring at me through the windshield. His face was still obscured by the shadow of his hat, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and unfeeling. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. I was frozen in place, unable to move, my heart hammering in my chest. Then, without warning, the man turned and walked back into the cemetery, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. I sat there for a long time, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew that I had to leave. I started the car and drove away, not daring to look back at the cemetery as I sped down the road. Later, when I finally calmed down, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. I told a friend about what happened, and she mentioned that others had seen a man like that in the cemetery before. A man who vanished before anyone could confront him. The thought sent chills down my spine. Who was he? Or rather, what was he? I still visit my father's grave, but now I go earlier in the day when the sun is high in the sky, and I'm not alone with the shadows and whatever lingers among them. I was off of work this night and relaxing at home. My roommate was out of town for a couple of days visiting his parents, and I was somewhat of a night owl, so I enjoyed staying up late. It was around 12, and I was sipping on a beer while watching TV when a faint sound came from above me. At first, I didn't even process it, like my body just ignored it. But after a few seconds, it kind of hit me as I realized it couldn't have been my roommate like it usually would have been. I looked up at the ceiling and muted the TV to try and listen for it again. A few seconds went by and there was nothing. The sound was so soft though. With the TV being on when I heard it, I really had no idea what it could have been or even where upstairs it came from. Although this sounds pretty dumb of me, I really didn't feel like getting up and wasn't worried enough about it to feel the need to check it out. I opened the mini fridge I had next to the couch and grabbed another beer, cracking it open and taking a few sips to get back to relaxing. But before I could even unmute the TV, I heard that same thump sound above me. I looked back up at the ceiling, and after a moment, I could hear subtle footsteps slowly walking in the room right above me. My whole body felt like it went numb. I got up from the couch and went over to the stairs. I stood at the bottom and could hear a thumping sound resonating through the hallway. I called out my roommate's name. I knew it couldn't be him, but I was just hoping that somehow it was. After there was no reply, I started scaling the stairs and flicked on the lights to the upstairs hallway. It was empty, but the door on the far end was open. It was to my roommate's room, but I was 100% certain that I'd closed it the day he left, and I never went in there since, so there should be no reason it was open right now. My heart was pounding as I walked through the hallway and looked inside the room. It looked the same as it did when he left. Everything was clean and nothing was out of place. I then went around and checked every room upstairs and still found nothing. I didn't sleep that night and spent the next couple days on edge as I waited for my roommate to get home. I never heard those sounds after that night or had any doors randomly open like that. At this point, I don't know what the hell happened. Maybe someone found a way in and out without me knowing, or maybe it was something else. To this day, I still don't know. I'm sure you've all heard that recently there's been an enormous data breach. 2.7 billion victims' personal information and social security numbers were stolen. This stolen personal data could allow people to gain access to your financial accounts or even steal your identity. So now it's more important than ever to take extra measures to ensure your security. There is really no better time than now to take advantage of Aura's security service. I've been regularly sponsored by Aura for over a year now, and it's because I honestly believe their service is amazing. Aura provides continuous monitoring of your personal data and resolves any potential threats that may come up, while also preventing future threats. They also make it incredibly easy for you to use and understand everything going on with your data. With their free trial, you'll be able to have Aura scan and remove your personal data from all over the internet, including scam centers, the dark web, data brokers, and hackers. After this, Aura will set up continuous monitoring on all of your data, ensuring any issues can be resolved rapidly by notifying you the instant something comes up. When I had first signed up, Aura immediately found dozens of places across the internet that already had my personal data, including my full name and address. In just a couple minutes, Aura cleared all of it. Especially in times like these, with huge data breaches and scams happening so often, having peace of mind knowing Aura is protecting your information is above anything. By using aura.com/whispered or scanning the QR code, you can get a completely free 14-day trial, allowing you to see if your personal data has been leaked, remove that data from multiple large platforms, and securely monitor your personal identity. I highly recommend using this opportunity to find any leaked info and ensure it is taken care of and secured. Thank you again to Aura for sponsoring this portion of today's video. I was camping in Utah for a small weekend getaway. It really was nothing special. I'd hiked up to a small lake and was only going to stay overnight. When I got there, it was more crowded than I was hoping for. I mean, there were two groups near the beach, so it wasn't flooding with people or anything, but it definitely wasn't quiet either. Around 5, though, both groups started packing up, and within the hour, they left the area. With only an hour left of sunlight, and having the beach to myself, I quickly changed into my swimsuit and jumped into the lake. I was only in there for like 10 minutes, not too long at all, when I looked back at the campsite. The woods were calm, and the sun was setting over the trees, but past the beach and a little ways into the forest, a person was watching me. They were too far for me to see much, but it was definitely a man, and they were definitely looking at me. As soon as I caught them looking, they turned their head and walked further into the trees. It was too creepy for me not to get a little shaken up. Was it just a guy from one of the groups that maybe forgot something? Or maybe a hiker that I happened to catch looking over at an awkward time? The way they were just stopped and standing there, looking directly at me, was still super unnerving. I walked back up the beach and over to my tent. I dried off and kept my head on a swivel, scanning the forest for that man. I cooked up a small meal and continued to look around for him. A whole hour passed, and there were no sightings, so I figured I was good. I stayed up fairly late, at least a couple hours after sunset, mostly looking up at the stars and resting. It sounds boring to just sit there, but it's actually really nice. After a while, I got in my tent and laid on my sleeping mattress. The hike up must have made me tired, because I fell asleep quickly. As soon as I woke up, though, I felt off. I didn't know why. It was the middle of the night and pitch black inside the tent. All I could hear were the insects chirping outside and a calm breeze blowing against the walls of the tent. I kind of just laid there for a while, maybe like 30 seconds, as my eyes were open but completely unable to see anything. Then my eyes started to adjust a little. I could see faint outlines of the things inside my tent, and as I moved my eyes around, they fell on the zipper. The tent flap was open, and between the opening, there was a shape. I must have stared at it for a whole 4 or 5 seconds as my heart rate spiked before my vision became just clear enough for me to make out a pair of eyes looking into mine. My adrenaline flooded through me, and my instincts took over. I grabbed my can of bear spray that I had laying next to me and shot it right at the opening. They yelled, and I could hear his footsteps moving away from the tent as I started tearing up and coughing. I fumbled through my backpack to get my pocket knife. Then I jumped out, fully prepared to fight for my life. But the man was gone. I didn't even know which direction he went or anything, but I didn't waste any time. I hurried to gather my things and used my handheld GPS to lead me back to the car without having to take the trail. I called police to come out and take me home, because by then my eyes were burning from the bear spray. They didn't find anything, but I don't know how much they searched. Whoever that was, and what they wanted, I honestly couldn't tell you. With the image of that guy staring into my tent burned into my head, I won't be out camping again for a long time. I work at a gas station. I'd been there for several years, and this night was one that I assumed would be like all the rest. I came in at 8 and took over for the day worker, who went home right away. The first couple hours went by quickly, as there were still customers coming in regularly to buy a few things or to pay for gas with cash. Between 11 and 12, it slowed down to where it began feeling like the shift was dragging on. I kept myself busy for another hour, or at least tried to, with stocking whatever I could find. But then I was left with the dreaded second half of my shift. It was always slow, boring, and just not enjoyable. Around 1, though, a car pulled in and parked in the spaces by the entrance door. A few other cars had come through recently, but just to get gas real quick. Very rarely would someone actually park in the spots and come into the store this late into the night. I stood up straight and tried to rub the tired look off my face, expecting them to come in. A couple minutes went by though, and they didn't. I leaned over the counter and looked out the glass door, but couldn't really see anything. The reflections on the door were blocking any way for me to see inside their car. Maybe they were just taking a break from a long drive. I didn't bother caring too much about it. I sat back and pulled up my phone. I spaced out, reading through random articles and whatnot for probably 20 or so minutes. During that time, I never heard anything or saw anything. But eventually I looked up from my phone and my heart almost stopped. There was a guy inside the store, standing in one of the aisles and looking right at me. His eyes darted away as soon as I saw him. This guy looked like he was mid-40, with a dark jacket on and a scruffy beard. I never saw or heard him enter, so how the hell did he get in? While my mind was racing, I just watched as the man kept walking around, glancing over at me a few times to see if I was looking, like he was planning to do something as soon as I looked away. Then after just 30 seconds, he suddenly hurried toward the front door and ran outside. I got up and ran to look out. This was when I noticed the car was still there, but the guy walked right past it and just out to the road until I could no longer see him. I immediately went to the cameras to see how he got in and figure out what was going on. It only took me a minute to find the footage of him slowly and quietly getting out of the car, then going to the back of the gas station. There were no cameras back there, but those doors were never locked since the gas station was technically always open anyway. What's really odd is that there were 15 minutes between the time he went around to the back to the time he walked out onto the sales floor. Police came to help me investigate, ultimately finding the car he left to have been a stolen vehicle from months ago. They didn't know anything about the guy or his motives. Sneaking around though, he clearly had something else intended for that night, and I think I was really lucky that for one reason or another, he decided not to go through with it. This was a long time ago, when I was 13. It was summer. I spent pretty much all day playing on my PS3 or watching whatever was on TV. Sometimes I'd go outside or hang with some friends, but it was raining this day, so I was hunkered down inside. My dad always worked until 10, and my mom was a nurse, so her schedule was all over the place. Most of this day, I was playing on the PS3, but around 7-ish, I went to the kitchen to make food. While I was in there, a knock came at the front door. I didn't really want to answer, and as a kid, I was always nervous when someone was at the door, so I waited a minute and tried to just be quiet until they left. After they knocked several more times, though, I snuck over to the door and looked out the peephole to see if maybe it was a neighbor or someone else I knew. I was really confused, though, and kind of alarmed to see a police officer. He was standing on our porch, looking around and waiting for me to answer, and now I felt like I had to. I opened the door. It was still cold and rainy outside, and the officer was drenched. Being a kid, my eyes were immediately drawn toward the gun on his hip, and overall, I just felt scared, or like I was in trouble. He asked my name, then reassured me that everything was okay, and I didn't have anything to worry about. He then smiled, as if trying to keep me calm, but his teeth were noticeably rotting and yellow, which then got me to notice how overall unkempt he looked. Like, usually cops were well put together, so this was really off-putting. He definitely noticed my hesitation, though, because he tried to speed up the conversation, saying he needed to search the home. I was terrified and confused, but I knew something was wrong, and that's when I noticed that there was no police car by my house. Especially with it raining, all these red flags piled up, and just as he was starting to step forward, I'd slammed the door and locked it. He didn't even try to say anything else. He immediately slammed something against the door, hard enough to shake the entire door and push me back a little. Thinking the door would give out, I ran to the home phone and dialed 911. I was freaking out so much, I'm surprised the operator even understood a word I said. The guy outside didn't give up the whole time, though, and was even there still, banging on the door when the actual police showed up. I heard him trying to convince them he was a real cop, but obviously that didn't go well. He was taken in, and initially my parents didn't tell me much about the charges, probably for my own safety. But a few years later, they told me that during the interrogation, the man admitted to attempting to kidnap me. Had I been any more trusting, I don't know where I'd be right now. My name is Leo, and I work for a pizza shop in my small town. I don't do deliveries or anything, but I do mostly everything there is to do inside the shop. I make pizzas, organize the stations, clean, and get all the closing tasks done every night before I leave. My interactions with customers is usually pretty minimal, since we have a few high school kids to take orders and everything. But they're only scheduled until 11 on weekdays. The shop closes at 12:30, so any orders or customers that come in after that, I have to take care of. This was a regular Monday shift. Everything went smoothly for the most part, and at 11 my coworker left, so it was just me to close up. It's usually really slow, so I started the cleanup process. About a half hour before closing, a call came in. Praying it wasn't for a last-minute order, I picked up the phone. I said my generic "thanks for calling, how can I help you" line, and right after I finished, there was a quiet pause. Then they hung up. I put the phone down and said a few choice words, thinking it was a prank call from a couple immature kids. I went back to the kitchen where I was cleaning, but not even 30 seconds later, I heard the bell ring by the door. The timing was annoying, but I put everything back down and walked back to the front. A guy was now standing at the counter. He had a heavy coat on and a black beanie over his shaggy hair. His eyes were what really put me off, though. He had dark circles and bags like he hadn't slept in days, yet his eyes were wide open. How can I help you?" I said, standing a couple feet from the counter. "I'd like to place an order right now." The way he said it was odd, and it very obviously told me that something was wrong with him. I said okay and asked what he wanted, but it almost seemed like he wasn't expecting me to say that. His eyes just continued to hold this disturbing stare at me as he struggled to respond. I looked away out of uncomfort, but my eyes fell on his hand that was partially out of his jacket pocket. He was holding a knife, like a typical kitchen knife. I think he was trying to hide it, but I could see the handle in his hand, and part of the blade was sticking out of his pocket. I felt my stomach drop and blood rush from my face, almost like I was gonna faint. I looked back up, and his eyes were still staring at me, but his face was stiff and emotionless. The sound of the door opening made both of us jump, and both of us looked over. It was some other random customer walking into the shop, and they immediately seemed to realize something was wrong. They stopped in place, stumbling over a few words, before the guy by the register suddenly walked past him and out the door. I used the phone to call 911 and tried to explain to the other customer what had happened. We also watched out the window as the guy got into his car and sped out of the parking lot. That was the last we saw of him, though. What I think happened was he parked outside the shop and watched in the window as he called us. Once he saw that it was me answering the phone, I guess he knew I was alone, so that's when he walked in. If not for the random customer walking inside in that moment, I don't know what would have happened. He was clearly insane and armed with a kitchen knife, so it couldn't have been good. Since then, I still haven't seen him come back, and I really hope I never do. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest, some great state parks, and a ton of fantastic camping spots. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor. While there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places, many people where I live are really struggling. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I can do most of my work online. If I didn't have that going for me, I'd probably have to move somewhere else. It's just one of those small towns that can rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay there too long, without anything else going for you at least. Excluding a handful of doctors, lawyers, and Georgia Power Company employees, the only employment in the area is at Walmart, fast food places, and a couple of grocery stores. To the east of my town, there's a massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy hiking on them with my dog, but it can be a bit of an unnerving experience sometimes. It's about a 10-mile drive from town, and there's no cell phone service or homes for miles. In the past, there have been a lot of vehicle break-ins at the trailheads. The gravel parking lots at some of them glitter with bits of broken glass from what I'm guessing were car windows. Sometimes, there are really shady people hanging around these trailheads or just driving around on the Forest Service roads. These are really rough roads, and you'll see these beat-up $500 cars just barreling along roads meant for a 4x4. Some of the people you see in the cars look like the guy who got crushed by an ATM in Breaking Bad. All that being said, it's still a great place to camp. However, you just have to be careful. A few years ago, 2 of my friends and I decided to go play paintball in the National Forest. We decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip so we could play the next morning too. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drove a couple of miles to one of the more popular camping spots. Unfortunately, a church group or something had taken up all the spots in the area. This was really the only camping spot we were familiar with, and it was getting pretty late. We decided to keep on looking, so we drove for about an hour further and further into the woods. By this time, it was getting a bit dark, and we were starting to worry about finding a spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but none of us had any service. We turned off onto an unfamiliar road that wasn't in very good shape. In fact, it looked like the Forest Service rangers had used a backhoe to block off the road with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. That said, it looked like 4x4 vehicles had been going over the mound, so it was pretty worn down. Our F-150 had pretty high clearance, so we decided to go over the mound. There was an old gravel road on the other side, and the road was pretty much clear of debris. We drove a few miles down this road, and came across an opening next to a small creek. There were some blue tarps hanging over a plywood table nailed to a tree, which seemed kind of odd. That said, it was pretty much dark at this point, and we didn't want to keep driving around all night looking for a camping spot. We left the truck lights running and set up the tent. As we were setting up the tent, I started to notice that there was a lot of trash in the woods surrounding the site. I saw a green bottle laying on the ground. I took a look at the label and saw that it was a bottle of home and garden insecticide. I was really tired at the time, and I just thought that someone had been dumping their home garbage out here. None of us thought it was weird that someone would be dumping garbage in an area that is more than an hour from the nearest home. We set up camp, had some beers, and made chili from scratch. By this time, it was probably around 11 p.m. As we were eating, we noticed a faint glow from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles didn't make sense. It didn't seem to be a bright light, and it wasn't moving. It was kind of like that glow you see over a bright city, but we couldn't see the light source itself. Since there were no other access roads in the area, we decided it wasn't other campers. The hill was about a quarter mile from our campsite, so we decided to go investigate. Under normal circumstances, I know I wouldn't have done so. However, we all had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, and 2 of us, Jacob and I, decided to take a look. My other friend, Isaac, decided to stay behind to pop some popcorn over the fire. We started walking towards the light source, and the situation got even stranger. All the trees in the area had their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. We thought it could have been the work of a beaver that lived in the creek. But it seemed strange that a beaver would go around all these trees and just knock the bark off in a circle. Jacob and I started talking about the ghost beaver in pretty loud voices, probably due to our drunkenness. As we were almost to the top of the hill, Jacob tripped and yelled, "Oh shit!" A few seconds after he yelled, the light, whatever it was, went out. We looked at each other and decided that maybe we didn't need to see what that light was after all. We walked back in silence, and kept looking back every few seconds. We decided to turn off our flashlight and just use the moonlight to get back to the campsite. When we got a couple of 100 feet from the campsite, I could see my other friend Isaac walking around the campsite. He was wearing a hooded coat that I hadn't seen him wearing before. For some reason, he was carrying his paintball gun around in his hand. That seemed a little odd, we said to each other. The fire had started to die down, so we couldn't see our campsite very well. At this point, we'd probably been gone for almost an hour. From the distance, it looked like Isaac was looking for something. He kept walking around the site and was peering into the tent. When we were almost back to the campsite, we saw Isaac walk up the road we came in on. We figured that he was going to use the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us. When we got back, we sat next to the fire and waited for Isaac to return. All of a sudden, we saw him lurch out of the tent. He stumbled a few feet and vomited. After we left, he had a few more rum and cokes. He mumbled. We asked him why he kept wandering around the campsite with the paintball gun, and he got a strange look on his face. They're locked up in the cab of the truck. Did you unlock it? We went to check the truck, entered the door code, and saw all our paintball equipment just as we had left it. The keys to the truck were still hidden in a magnetic fob underneath. I got a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. Isaac, what were you doing after we left? I asked. I was watching a movie on my phone. Then I fell asleep, I guess. But you were walking around with your paintball gun, right? Did you just change jackets? Isaac said he had been in the tent since we left, and that he had been wearing the same unhooded fleece all night. Someone had been walking around our campsite, and it wasn't Isaac. At this point, all of us were way too drunk to drive, but we decided to go ahead and pack up and go back to my house for the night. We didn't bother packing up the tent. We just folded it down with the sleeping bags and everything in it. We jumped in the F-150, and I started to drive out. When we got to the dirt hump, we saw something gray blocking our path. The metal barrier that had been lying in the woods earlier was now back on its stand, right on top of the hump. By this point, all of us had sobered up to the situation. No one wanted to get out of the car to try to move the barrier. I had a metal guard on the front of the F-150, so I drove forward slowly, tapping the metal barrier with the front of my truck. It fell right off. It must have just been balanced on top, and we drove over it slowly. We were terrified that it would pop one of the truck's tires as we drove over it, but it didn't. As we drove down the road, we saw a vehicle following us with its lights off. It was probably 1,000 feet behind us, but we kept catching glimpses of it as the moon reflected light off it. I started to drive as fast as I could on the Forest Service road, and the other vehicle kept pace. It didn't get any closer, though. It stayed just 1 or 2 turns behind us. We could only see it when the road straightened out. After about 45 minutes of speeding along gravel roads, we made it back to the main paved road. I started to drive everyone back to my house, but I decided to take a different route just to be safe. Camping can be fun, but very rural camping can be dangerous. I've driven past that metal barrier since that time, but it's always been in place. I would never go down that road again, though. At the time, I was living in Traverse City, Michigan. For those wondering, it's a beautiful landscape with huge glacier-carved hills and Lake Michigan at your back. I rented a little townhouse with a longtime friend a little ways outside the city. I had just gotten a hold of my old bicycle, which I'd had shipped up from my old hometown, and I was raring to start riding around. And that's how this all got started. It was my day off, and I decided to save gas and ride my bike into town. I geared up, checked my tires, and roared off. I had been big on riding my bike once upon a time, and it came back like, well, riding a bike. What I didn't notice, however, was how quickly I was moving. If I'd been paying attention, I would have realized the constant downward slope I was on, and how biking back up it would likely pose a difficulty for my winter-lapsed muscles. But none of that mattered at the time. I made it into town, did some shopping, met up with my roommate for dinner, and generally had a good time until I noticed the sun was setting. So I bid my adieus, hopped on my bike, and pedaled off into the sunset. At first, I did all right, but that aforementioned incline wore me down. By the time I reached the last leg of my journey, it was pitch black, and I was walking my bike. At that point, the road faced me with a choice. On my left was the regular road, which was better lit but also a longer trek to get to the townhouse row I occupied. On my right was my more regular route to and from town. I drove it every day, and had used it to come into town that very day, in fact. It was heavily wooded and unlit, but featured a shorter route, albeit with a steeper hill. I figured since I was already walking, I might as well just take the shorter, familiar path. So I turned on my bike's headlamp and headed into the even greater darkness of the road through the woods. All went well for a bit. I trudged along and cursed myself for being so stupid and overconfident with my bike. Then I heard it. Footsteps off to my right side in the woodland. I stood still, and they stopped abruptly. There, in the blackness, I debated what it might be, but as a veteran of the woods, I hoped it was just local wildlife and continued on. The footsteps started up again. They stopped when I stopped, just a hint later. I started and stopped once more, to be sure I wasn't hearing things. This last time, the steps continued for a solid 10 seconds after I had stopped, making me sure something, or someone, was out there. I still do not know what it was, though I logically leaned towards human, as the gait sounded bipedal and more precise than a quadruped. With this in mind, I weighed my options. If I dropped the bike and ran towards home, it would be far too easy to catch me. The same was true even if I ran back towards town. I was not in any way prepared for a chase, and I didn't want to initiate one. My mind strayed to the utility knife I always carry in my purse, but I shoved that thought aside. I have enough martial arts training to know the knife was a bad idea, and I was more comfortable taking whoever or whatever was out there barehanded, rather than escalating things with a blade. Instead, I called my roommate, who was still in town, gave her my location, and told her what was happening. She told me she'd be there in 10 minutes. I hung up and started walking again. The footsteps started up too, this time faster and out of sync with mine. And that's when I got mad. I have a weird thing where fear makes me angry and hostile, and being stalked through the woods had officially punched my buttons from terrified to murderous. So I turned to the woods and roared, with a voice I didn't know I had. How about you come on out and face me, you piece of shit? I'll rip your stomach open and wear your intestines for a necklace. For the life of me, I don't know where I got the guts or the words for that. It might well have been a bad move. But the woods were rather abruptly quiet, and nothing came at me. I stayed still, staring hard, ready to beat the shit out of anything that moved. Nothing did. Then my roommate came on the scene, her headlights almost blinding me as she turned the curve to where I was. I tossed my bike in her car, and we hauled ass homeward. I collapsed once I got home, vomited from pure nerves, and finally fell asleep around 3 a.m. And that's my story. I'm not sure of much, I will grant you. Was it a person? An animal? I feel compelled to lean towards the former, if for no better reason than because it sounded like a person walking. And what animal would be so precise in its stalking and winding me up? But who knows? Maybe I just scared the shit out of some poor porcupine. Regardless, I'd rather not encounter it again. At the time, I was a 20-year-old female, and I had just moved alone to a small town in upstate New York. I had grown up in another, slightly larger town about 60 miles away, and just wanted a fresh start. I love camping, and often go camping in the Adirondacks, but at that time, I hadn't yet made friends to go camping with, so I wasn't going to venture into the real woods alone. Down the road from where I lived, I found an area where power lines cut through a wooded section. The power lines were perpendicular to the road. It was near a house, but far enough to the right of the house that I thought people wouldn't mind if I walked up the trail that the power lines created. So, I wandered up there, noticing how it was actually pretty deep woods. I managed to get far enough from the house that they couldn't possibly think I was trying to break in or anything. Then, bing! An idea struck me. I could go camping up here. It was secluded enough to give the real woods experience, but close enough to the road that I wouldn't be in real danger from wildlife or anything. Sweet. So I did. I set up camp in this little clearing that I accessed by climbing the hill, following the power lines, and then turning left onto what seemed to be a deer trail. Deer are everywhere in New York. Eventually, I came upon this really nice, flat, grassy clearing. I built my fire off to the side, after making sure to clear away the dead wood, etc. I was feeling really smart and independent. It was creepy to sleep in the woods alone, as I had always had at least one camping companion, but whatever. The next day, I decided to wander further down the path to see where it led. I walked for about a half hour and could see some fields on the right, but they were in the distance, and there was a fence between the fields and the path. So again, I figured people couldn't be mad at me for being there. Then I came across another path heading to the right. I followed it. A couple of feet in, it curved slightly, and there was an old van on the left of the path. Well, that's strange, but it was about 1 p.m., near noon anyway, broad daylight. Birds were chirping, so I felt no danger. I walked up to the van, which had obviously been there a very long time. It was a 70s-style van. It reminded me of the Scooby-Doo van, and was way overgrown with weeds. There were streaks of brownish red running down the side from the bottom of the doors. I looked in and saw what appeared to be old bedding in the back, but it was all shredded. The curtains in the windows were shredded, and the clothing strewn about looked like it was from the 70s or early 80s. I still felt no danger signs. Snickering at the terrible fashions back in the day, I continued along the path for a short time, until I finished rounding the slight bend. I stopped dead in my tracks. Finally, my reptile sense, or whatever you want to call it, woke the hell up and started screaming at me, full volume. Up ahead, there was a creepy-ass doll hanging from the trees by its neck. It was hung with a rope, not just stuck in the trees. Just to the left of that, there was an old garage, overgrown with weeds. To the right of it, though, there was this huge cage-like structure, easily big enough to hold a full-sized man. It seemed to be made up of pipes and other long metal objects, just kind of welded together. Some were up and down, some were across, and the squares they made weren't big enough to fit my head through. It had 4 sides and a ceiling. It also had other creepy-ass dolls hanging from it. There were also reddish-brown stains running down the sides, just like the van. Further behind it, there was a run-down house. Creeped out as all hell, I just turned tail and ran. I am not a runner. I am a chunky girl. I had smoked for 6 years at that point, and I do not run. But I ran that day. I don't even remember the run. I just remember coming upon my campsite, grabbing my tent in one swoop as I ran past. Luckily, I had put my things inside the tent, and ripping it out of the ground as I continued running. I left my cooler, my food, everything behind. I never went back for it either. I dropped the tent stakes somewhere along the way and had to repair rips in my tent. I tore down the hill. I'm still surprised I didn't break my neck. Jumped in my car and sped home. I locked all my doors and then paced my house going, "What the fuck?" for hours. It's been 11 years since that incident, and even typing it now makes my hands shake. I now live almost 1,400 miles away, but I still just made sure my doors were locked. The crazy thing is, it wasn't even in deep woods. Maybe in the 70s it was, though, who knows. As it stands now, though, there are people living within a short walk of that place. I didn't call the cops. I can't really articulate why. My best analysis, looking back, is that I didn't want that creep to come find me. I should have, yes. You're right. I'm just hoping it was an old crime scene and not some sick fuck who still keeps people in cages in the woods. My friends and I decided to go camping one spring break. We had planned a week in advance, and as the day got closer, the weather got worse. It was cold and gray, which is unheard of for Arkansas. The night finally came, along with yet another cold front. It was in the 30s, but we had dressed warmly and stocked up on whiskey and beer. The plan was to hit a spot my buddy knew, which was barely accessible with his 4x4. We wanted to really camp. None of those designated sites for families and seniors in RVs. So we aimed away from civilization, comprising just a single stoplight and a couple hundred people, and drove into the woods. After 30 minutes of bone-rattling dips across dry creek beds and detours around trees, it started to rain. By the time we found camp, it had turned into hail. The spot was marked by an ancient dirt road a few hundred feet long and the rotting carcass of a Volkswagen Bug. That night was spent passing a bottle around, hoping we'd figure out the tense before we were too drunk. Eventually, we did, and managed to start a fire with diesel. By this point, the hail had stopped. The empty whiskey bottle lay broken in the fire, and we had a decent pile of empties growing. We drank, we played cards, and we passed out in our tents. The next morning, I gradually regained consciousness to the sound of something large being dragged past my tent. It was what looked to have once been a station wagon, stripped and rust-covered, dragging the VW with a chain. The VW had been there for so long that the floor had rotted out and roots had tied it to the forest floor. They lay scattered in the wake of the wagon. A woman was driving, a man sat beside her, and 3 shirtless kids sat in the back where there used to be seats. The man stared out the window, away from us the entire time. The children had dirt smeared on their faces, which illuminated their glassy 1,000-yard stares. It's the look of crushing poverty, and you've probably only seen it in pictures. It exists in war-torn countries, the projects in inner cities, and the deep south. So deep that the old gas station back in town, a place you'd probably jokingly hum the Deliverance theme, was the city to these people. She spoke in a deep, nicotine and whiskey-soaked drawl. Y'all come from the city to do some camping. Well, reckon that's fine, long as you ain't doing no drugs. Y'all ain't doing drugs, are ya? We weren't. Just drinking, then. Hell, I like a drink now and again my darn self, that's fine, that's just fine. Want to know how I knew y'all was here? Seen them black helicopters flying around. Them some boys that work for me, see. This is my land, and they told me. Can't be too careful. Figured I'd best check it on out. She started laughing. Mucus bubbled up to wet her dry cackle. The man stared out at nothing, and one of the children put both hands on the window and gazed through us. His mouth hung open, and spit cut a line through the filth on the glass. He was probably 10 years old. Y'all know Bethany? We didn't. Ha! Everyone knows old Beth. Y'all go to church? I lied. Good. Ain't got time for those that don't fear God. Why don't you come on to church tomorrow? You can meet Bethany. It's just over that hill up there. Can't miss it. Boy, she'd sure like to meet y'all. They all would. We assured her we would. She drove away into the trees, slowly dragging the Volkswagen. As soon as she left, we all looked at each other and started laughing. It was just nerves. There wasn't anything funny about it. We all have the remnants of a primitive warning system for danger. It's been eroded by living safe and civilized. But every once in a while, it goes off, and you obey it without question. Something is wrong. It started before she spoke, when I looked into her eyes. Something is wrong. The kids, the man, her laugh. Eventually we did hike up the hill. You could see for a mile. There was nothing. No buildings, no clearings, just forest. We cut our trip short, packed up, and left before noon.